where should we start?
Yeah, actually, I should have worked and prepared for school today, but I sort of got dragged into a wormhole of thoughts this morning and sort of um, spent most of my day thinking about these questions. And so I went down a rabbit hole of thinking about this idea of quantifying um, the degree of sort of experience a bit. And I remembered this theory from Tononi and Koch, IIT. I'm not sure. Yeah, you're nodding.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
integrated information theory. Yeah.
Integrated information theory, exactly. Sorry, oops, sorry. So, um, and yeah, I was trying to figure out whether this is compatible with Whitehead's framework or not. It seems, at least at first glance, to be, but then I got a bit unsure about it later on in the day again, and
Sure.
then I stumbled. Um, yeah.
I'm getting this book because
Yeah.
they talk about IIT and
I have
some of the
it
problems with it.
somewhere as well. But I didn't read it yet, so I should. I definitely should then. And I also stumbled upon uh, the free energy principle, which I know you discussed with Tim,
Mm.
right? At some
Many
length.
times. Yeah.
Yeah, where when I was listening to your talks, I didn't know what it was, and so I couldn't really follow the arguments. So now I think I understand a bit better what this is all about and how the term of free energy is sort of borrowed from thermodynamics through information theory into cognitive science, and how this might also apply in a Whiteheadian framework. But yes, and then from there, actually, I got sucked into trying to reconcile these things with my trial to integrate quantum mechanical wave function collapse into the picture. And so I tried to understand whether Shannon entropy in the free energy principle could be replaced with von Neumann entropy in a quantum mechanical context. And around that time, my brain decided to shut down, and and I lost track of where I was. So yeah,
Mm.
that's where I'm at the moment.
Great. Well, I mean, so much there already. So, well, let's talk about integrated information theory,
Mhm.
and we can maybe work our way to the free energy principle, because I think both are, um, yeah, providing, I think, really robust models that help us get a grip on this otherwise very mysterious phenomenon of consciousness. Um, the integrated information theory, I think, came under attack maybe late last year. This group of like 125 materialists researching consciousness thought that IIT was pseudoscience, and they staked their own reputations against it. And I think that's a really unfortunate turf war because um, what underlies that are some unacknowledged metaphysical presuppositions and a lot of unfortunate professional politics, uh, competition for grant funding, really.
Hmm.
And so
Okay.
IIT had gotten uh, some money, I think, from the Templeton Foundation, and they were trying to empirically test it
Hmm.
and refine it. I mean, one of the benefits of IIT is that it is making testable hypotheses, but as it turns out, I think in the studies that were done, there was still too much interpretive wiggle room in the theory itself to really
Yeah.
judge whether the experiments that were done either verified it or not,
Hmm.
or disconfirmed it. So still, though, the experiments help refine the theory. But I think in terms of whether it's compatible with Whitehead, superficially, yeah, there's definitely, I would say, a similarity in the sense that IIT seems to imply that experience to some degree is present anywhere information is integrated. Um,
Hmm.
and so there's some degree of integration happening in every physical process, with brains, nervous systems being especially adept at that, and so increasing the intensity. But beyond that sort of superficial similarity, and that IIT would imply panpsychism is why this group of materialists was like, oh, that can't be true. So
Yeah,
they
yeah, I
reason
understand.
backwards from an unacceptable consequence of it to say, well, no, doesn't, that can't be true. But one of the axioms in IIT, I think the first axiom is affirming that experience is akin to a kind of non-relational intrinsic property of a system. Um, and so
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
is incompatible with a process relational ontology. For Whitehead, experience is more about relations, and nature itself is composed of relational events or relational processes rather than systems realizing experience, which would be isolated and intrinsic simply to that system. And so right off
Yeah.
the bat with that first axiom, we're parting ways. And
Okay.
does
I
that
was, yeah, I was um thinking that it might be so my I thought maybe in the sort of the process of concrescence, I didn't see how IIT could apply sort of to the processual nature, to the process, as you say, and in the relational sense, but strictly sort of in the moment of the actual occasion reaching satisfaction, looking at or judging basically the not the content per se, but the makeup of the actual occasion. I thought that in that moment, maybe IIT could be used to sort of compute this phi value of sort of a degree of integration that occurred in order for this moment to arise. But then it would again sort of be given back to the process, and in the next moment, you could reestablish a new phi value. Um, that was my thinking, that maybe sort of at each end of the concrescence, sort of you could evaluate using IIT's framework. Um, yeah, that was my thinking, but um,
Mhm.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the axioms more closely again, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the arguments that the authors of this book, The Blind Spot, Evan Thompson, Marcelo Gleiser, and Adam Frank make, and there's two physicists there, and Thompson is a philosopher and phenomenologist, and he thinks it's wrongheaded to look at experience as something which could be explained in some kind of axiomatic deductive way based on uh, these kind of postulates,
Hmm.
because it's intrinsically fluid and interactive, and the way that we describe experience changes the experience. And so it's, on the one hand, I think a valiant effort on the part of the IIT researchers to formulate a testable hypothesis whereby we could make some translation between qualitative experience and sort of informational, um, an informational metric of some kind that would
Hmm.
quantify that. Um, and I'm, open to seeing where that leads. But I think it's at the level of phenomenology and how we directly relate to experience, perhaps off to a bad start in the sense that how it has treated consciousness or experience, that
Hmm.
which it is ostensibly trying to study, in some ways doesn't do justice to the full uh, qualitative complexity of that experience.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but I hear what you're saying that, there is in the satisfaction achieved by an actual occasion of experience through its process of concrescence, um, what begins as fully relational in the sense
Hmm.
that this occasion is growing out of its relations to the past and achieving a moment of subjective immediacy, which Whitehead would admit is private. There's the
Yep.
achievement of a private perspective that's novel, never occurred before. The universe has never seen itself in this way in its entire history. But as soon as that private satisfaction of experience is achieved, it perishes and becomes food for the next occasion to digest
Yeah.
in its pursuit of this moment of satisfaction. And so there does seem to be an integration of prehensions going on in the
Yes.
process of concrescence. And so certainly I understand why that analogy became apparent to you. And maybe there's something there, but I think Whitehead's speaking at the level of ontology when he describes the phases of concrescence. This is a metaphysical description, whereas I get the sense that IIT is looking for a description at the level of physics and physiology.
Yeah, it's
Um,
trying to get at an empirical
yeah,
system, right? Of actually, as you said, testable hypotheses, which, as far as I understood, um, even a few years back, there were some indications of like from like mapping brain connectivity in a waken state and in a sleeping state, that their calculations showed that, yeah, in the sleeping state their value of phi seems to be a bit lower than when the subject was awake. And in that sense, they got some initial results that I think I really liked, because, and also because how I got there, in remembering IIT, was from this idea of the inherent and intimate interplay of objective and sort of physical reality and subjective and internal reality in Whitehead's framework, that there should be some possibility to be able to judge internal,
mm,
at least sort of possibility for internal subjective experience, or as in a measurable, quantifiable way, by virtue of looking at the objective constitution of a system, so of the makeup of the system, of in the sense of this, that is where the question that I wrote you about the complex amplifiers came from, right? So if we look at the makeup of a system, that in a, for example, a biological system that we judge to be a complex amplifier, meaning it can amplify the these fundamental droplets of experience and integrate them into a bigger whole, into a actual yeah uh, something that's more than the sum of its parts, right? Um, and so I was wondering what your point of view on that was, basically, of this idea that because Whitehead's framework um, couples internal feelings basically all the way down into all of physical reality, whether that would or wouldn't imply the possibility of sort of the other way around, of then, yeah, looking at physical reality and making judgments or guesses, at least, about the internal states, or possibility of internal states of the system. And that is when I remembered that, oh yeah, IIT does something akin to that. It looks at the structure from like the objective structure of the outside and uses that to um, yeah, sort of equating that basically with this value of phi that they then associate with internal um, experiential value or depth.
Yeah. Um, a lot comes to mind there. I want to return to the question about complex amplifiers.
Please.
But how we distinguish what counts as a system, where the boundaries of a system are. I mean, it's totally dependent on our own interests and our own perspective as observers. And similarly, information is relative to each of us as observers. What counts as information for me, what is salient, and when I attend to it, what sort of lowers my decreases uncertainty for me might be different from what decreases uncertainty for you, to think of information in Shannon's terms. And so there's no real I mean, if we know the sender and the receiver, we can quantify information, a message that's sent from one to the other. It doesn't matter what the message is, it's just the syntax that matters. Um, and I think when IIT starts to try to treat information, I do worry that it's somewhat reifying information as though it existed free floating, independent of any particular observer's decision about, this is the boundary of this particular system, and we're going to measure how information is integrated within the boundaries of this system that we have carved out. Now, in the case of organisms, that's easier. But in the case of, say, we want to know how much information a galaxy is integrating, well, there's some organizational pattern there that would lend credence to the idea that it's a self-organizing system with an interior experiential perspective, perhaps. Um, but on the other hand, when we're trying to measure the integrated information in a human body, are we looking at the brain as the system? What about individual neurons? They're each integrating information. And so, I'm sure IIT has ways of dealing with the scale issue of looking at cells as information integrators, neurons, say, and then the whole nervous system and the whole body. But also, what if consciousness is not located in the brain, but something emergent from our social interactions? And so, just as neurons um, are part of this collective process within our skulls and bodies, each of our brains connects up into, larger groups, and the consciousness that is achieved in the context of that kind of social interaction is itself a new emergent property, a new system with its own boundaries that could be integrating information at an even higher scale. And so there's a relativity here. Maybe that's okay, but when we try to measure, the integrated information, I think instead of imagining that there's a simple cut and dry boundary around one system and another system, it very much depends what our interests are as the ones doing the measuring. Um, the application for people who are in the persistent vegetative state is that medical application is super important, and if even if all that this IIT research allows us to do is determine if there's still someone home inside or not, I mean, then that's reason enough, to pursue it.
That would be huge, I think, right? Yeah, yeah. Um, so, responding to the question of boundaries, um, what would Whitehead say? I mean, wouldn't his scale-free approach lend credence to the idea that yeah, basically boundaries can be drawn arbitrarily at any scale, and you can look at actual occasions on any scale, and you would find internal moments of satisfaction for that scale? No? So, I mean, if we say, yeah, an electronic occasion has an internal subjective component of realizing itself, um, and but then the electron is part of an atom, which wouldn't that atom then in itself have the capacity of having a subjective experience as being an atom composed of electrons and protons and neutrons, and the atom being part of a molecule, the molecule being part of, let's say, protein and part of a cell and so forth. Wouldn't each scale allow for individual subjective feeling, and um, then basically, again, I think as far as I understood this idea of complex amplifiers, the question is then, yeah, would the higher scale allow for a kind of interaction that um, has this high degree of interconnectedness of the parts that allow for the whole feeling to be really a um, integrated whole of its parts, again as being more than the sum of its parts. And when we look at, let's say, a crystal composed of many 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 atoms, um, compared to, let's say, a single cell, which might have less atoms inside, but just having a so much higher degree of organization, that I think you wouldn't mind ascribing more potential for subjective feeling to the that system single cell than to the regular structure of a huge crystal. Uh, right. I'll leave it
Right.
there. I'll let you respond.
Right. Um, Despite the regularity and order present in a crystal, I think Whitehead would still consider that to be an aggregate, despite the fact that it's also self-organizing. Um, there's no organizational patterning in the form that the atoms take in a crystal that would be channeling routes of transmission to some centralized hub, affording deeper integration. Biological organisms, whether we're just talking about the membrane in single-celled creatures or the elaborate nervous systems of animals, um, we are so organized so as to uh, channel the transmission of feelings and animals do this more than plants, but just to centralize the um, various channels flowing into our through our senses and our bodily feeling. Um, and Whitehead would say, the brain is obviously the place where these routes of transmission are meeting, yeah, coalescing, um, being filtered, amplified. And there is something that's not just arbitrary about that distinction. It's not just that an observer has said, "Oh, I'm going to treat this animal body as a unit, but not that crystal." It's like, no, there's something about the way these two different entities are organized that would suggest objectively, in a sense, that the animal body is more likely to house a higher intensity form of experience. Um, and there's a way in which, in Whitehead's scheme, what in one moment is private subjective satisfaction in the next moment becomes publicly expressed. And so there's a oscillation from privacy back to publicity, from interiority to exteriority. And that means that so Whitehead would say that contemporary occasions of experience occur in causal independence of each other. And this follows from relativity theory. There's a finite speed of causation, or speed of light, right? And so
Yeah, so you have time-like and
separation, yeah,
causal
yeah,
relations. Yes, yes, okay.
which is what affords the moment of privacy. In the
Mm-hmm.
present, I can have my private experience, you can have your private experience, but as soon as that perishes, what I just experienced is objectified in your next moment of experience, and vice versa, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we're passing into and out of each other in that sense.
Yes.
Um, and so in Whitehead's scheme, there's no difference in principle between my own relation now to my past occasions of experience and my own relation now to your past occasions of experience. The difference is only one of intimacy, of inheritance, and
Yep.
identification, but
Yep.
it's ultimately, um, I can experience your past experience just as much as I can experience my own past experience. It's the same principle of inheritance and the transmission
Mm-hmm.
of feelings that's at play, right? And so this Whitehead's both allowing there to be this moment of privacy, but also showing how profoundly um, how profoundly relational our experience is. And the closer we are to a person, the more this becomes apparent. Um, that we can live
Yes.
in each other's thoughts, finish each other's sentences and so on. Um, Now, in terms of galaxies and stars and atoms as information integrators, right? As experiential beings, I think there's a strong case to be made that there is a similar kind of complex amplification of environing um, feelings um, occurring in these systems, because they do seem to be wholes in their own right. Um, and Whitehead's understanding of the world is that the world is made of wholes, right?
Yeah.
All the parts are themselves recapitulations of the entirety of the universe in time and space. So the whole history recapitulated, and um every other entity that is in the past, like cone of
Mm-hmm.
a newly concressing entity, is also being prehended.
Mm-hmm.
And so, galaxies are clearly, they're self-organizing um systems, and I think there's more and more evidence of a kind of interconnectivity between all the components. All the stars in the galaxy seem to be related through plasma filaments, and each galaxy seems to be related through plasma filaments to other galaxies. And so there's a great deal of, there's at least a suggestion of a kind of avenue or route by which feelings could be transmitted. right?
Yeah, I mean, if when I remember back at looking at cosmological simulations showing the distribution of dark matter throughout the evolution of the universe, um, it looks just like a microscopic fly by fly into the connectivity of human brain cells, right? It's just if you wouldn't you could show that animation to somebody and say it's a simulation of the connections of human brain cells, and they would probably shrug it off as, oh yeah, that could be um, as far as I remember those images. um, yeah, but so I can't, I still can't shrug off this intuition that IIT's notion of this phi function um, could still be a valuable helping helper to identify and quantify this idea of a complex amplifier. Because again, yeah, I absolutely agree that a crystal is sort of a self-organizing system, but I would still not think that it has I mean, yeah, I would think there's something going on inside. I think the crystal, for example, will sort of hear music in the sense that vibrations have an effect on it, and every effect on a system will have a internal representation of that causal effect. But in terms of possibilities of amplification of as you said signals coming into that system and being transmitted through certain pathways in order to be integrated and amplified. I wouldn't see that in a crystal, because I can cut the crystal in parts and basically still have crystals which are self-similar to the whole. So I can look at the crystal as just a sum of its parts, at least to some degree. If I cut it too small, then yeah, it's not no longer a crystal. It will be single molecules. But to a certain degree, I can look at that system as being just a sum of parts. Whereas if I cut myself in half, I wouldn't look at myself as just, yeah, I have now two separate parts that are similar to the whole. There's a, as you said, there's a distinct wholeness associated with certain kinds of systems that I think we do not associate with other kinds of systems. And I just can't help myself but feeling that this notion of quantifiable degree of integration of information is very similar in the two frameworks in how I understand Whitehead and how I read IIT. And it has to be said, I didn't. I think I read the IIT 3.0 paper once, but it was like a few years back, and I don't really remember all the tiny details of the axioms and stuff. But yeah, I was intrigued by it then, and it came up again now, and uh, I still see some parallels. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the intricacies of the connection between the formalism and the axioms enough to say, but if the axioms could be tweaked so as to embrace a relational understanding of experience, then perhaps we'd be off to the races in terms of a convergence with Whitehead's metaphysics. Um, so maybe IIT 5.0 will be able to pull that off. I'm not sure. Um,
Maybe because yeah, I think you might have to add some things as to also in terms of maybe so integrating not only sort of internal complexity, maybe yeah, integrating relational complexity as well, and maybe also then having some way of integrating also the possibilities. So the sort of the other side of the equation in Whitehead's framework, right? So the and there again, I came firstly back to quantum mechanics, where I see the wave function basically representing the sort of the possibility space, which opens up for the newly forming concrescence from sort of the spectrum from which it can choose its actuality. And that is also where then the free energy principle sort of popped up in in my day, because as I understand, they also look at sort of the emergence of consciousness much like Whitehead does on a higher degree, where when he really stops talking about feelings and experience and uses the actual word consciousness, right? This is when he also has this contrasting between the actual and the possible, as far as I understood, right? And is it correct that there's a similarity to the free energy principle of having consciousness being somehow related to this awareness of error in predictions of possibilities and actual sensual reality, feelings of felt reality? Or yeah,
Yeah.
could you enlighten me on how the free energy principle relates to Whitehead's framework?
Yeah. I just was reading a few papers on the whole predictive processing paradigm, and the free energy principle is one, I think, particularly interesting generalization of Bayesian brain understandings. So in the free energy principle, this applies not just to nervous systems, but any enduring physical entity in nature can be subject to the same analysis.
Okay.
A rock rolling down a hill, you could use the same formalism and free energy principle to understand how it maintains its own order and organization as a rock in interacting with the environment. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's a like Whitehead's metaphysics, it's scale free in that sense. It could be applied across different domains. And I think the connection you're making between Whitehead's account of this contrast between actuality and possibility does sound a lot like the um, comparison that's supposed to be going on according to FEP, um, between our priors and sense data. And so the nervous system and cognition as such is an attempt to minimize error. And so it's a conception of cognition, um, based, I think, on the idea that what's driving organisms in their pursuit of the maintenance of their lives is a fear of error. And they would say also the pleasure that comes from resolving that difference between a wrong prediction and uh, the sensory data, which would clue us into the fact that we've made a wrong prediction. And so we feel pleasure when those align, the prediction and the
Hmm.
sense data align, and we feel pain or irritation when they don't. But I think Whitehead would want to say that life is not reducible merely to this task of error minimization. There's also, if you want, evident in living organisms an expression of eros maximization, which is to
Hmm.
say, um, one of the challenges that's presented to the predictive processing approach or to FEP would be the question of spontaneity and originality, improvisation, play. Because if organisms are to be understood primarily as systems seeking to minimize surprisal, then how do we explain the fact that organisms play, that they learn, that they do seek out novel experiences? That seems to be a challenge to this framework, which again, I mean, it's similar to the emphasis placed in physics on entropy instead of recognizing the tendency towards organization, which is also present there. And I know there are ways, that these two tendencies can be understood as compatible, and like all of the order and organization emergent on the earth is only increasing the global entropy, and so there's no contradiction, but
Yeah, there's no contradiction, but there's still no explanation why there should be local
right.
order in standard physics. Yeah, yeah, I was thinking about this the same thing when you explained FEP now as a yeah.
Yeah. And there are responses to these challenges, but it's a very lively debate in the journals about whether
Hmm.
FEP can account for spontaneity, improvisation, and so on, or whether it's locked into this sort of just minimizing surprise as much as possible. So,
Yeah, I mean the naive way of looking at it for me, as you said, with the analogy to physics, would be to assume that yeah, probably it will not contradict or rule out the possibility of spontaneity, but it will probably have a really hard time coming up with an explanation for why it should be there. This is something I think that's apart from biology, which has embraced the idea of evolution. Apart from that, this whole idea of a process that's going towards something or forwards in time is absent in all the other disciplines, right? I think, and really missing, I think, in and which is why I was so fascinated, sorry, by Whitehead's account, because the this idea of creativity being sort of the most fundamental principle really sort of solves this problem from the get-go, right? Because yeah, it's just sort of assumed from start that you have this principle in the universe, and I think that solves so many of these questions or problems. And it solves again, coming back to the problem that's sort of dearest to my heart, the wave function collapse in quantum mechanics. Again, I think all the interpretations and ideas of how to deal with that problem in the measurement problem in quantum mechanics sort of at best can show that it's not impossible for it to happen, but none of them actually make it a necessity. And I think Whitehead frameworks does, because it says, yeah, it's there's an internal aim of a actual occasion to self-realize. And so this is and because it strives towards this creative moment of creativity, of creating itself. Um, and so I think this is absolutely needed in any theory somehow, and it will need to be incorporated and accepted at some point that, yeah, we really need this in order to really understand anything that's going on in the world.
mm. Yeah, yeah, I think. I'll circle back to the wave function, but
Please.
there's another um, branch or subdiscipline in the predictive processing arena called active inference, um, which people like Andy Clark uh, have developed. Andy Clark's a cognitive scientist who developed the idea of the extended mind, so that you know all of the tools and implements from pen and paper to calculators to smartphones now, we're externalizing our memory, but even our cognition into the environment. And so rather than thinking of cognition as something just going on inside the head, it's fully embodied and extended out into the world. Um, Language itself as an example of this cognitive prosthetic that allows us to think in ways that
Yeah.
without language we'd be lost at sea. I mean, um, but he develops a version of predictive processing called active inference that points out the ways in which um, we're not just uh, coming up with priors to um, generate a kind of hallucinatory inner experience of the world that we error correct as new sense data comes in, but organisms can also act so as to change the external world and thereby bring the sense data back into alignment with the priors. So we can actually make what wasn't true
Yep.
true, by interacting with the environment in some way. And so this is emphasizing the agency of organisms in actively inferring the state of the world, where the activity actually changes the world so as to make the inference correct.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's a helpful emphasis that he brings to his work. But um, there's still in his approach a sense in which, despite his emphasis on the extension of cognition, um, that ultimately all that we can experience as organisms is going to be um, a kind of controlled hallucination. Our only access to the world is through our sense experience, which gives us data that has more to do with the structure of our sense organs than it does with anything in the world.
Okay. Yep.
Um, and so Clark will say the world itself is off limits to our perception and our cognition,
Mm. Mm.
um, even if it's there seems to me to be a tension here between his two commitments to extended cognition and then active inference. But um, in terms of, I think I can connect this to the issue of a kind of Whiteheadian interpretation of the wave function. Um, and maybe the bridge here would be one interpretation of quantum theory, quantum Bayesianism, qubit
Hmm.
theory. Chris Fuchs, I believe, is the main proponent of that. And his reading of quantum physics and the wave function is that this is epistemological. That we're really talking about, um, making predictions about what's going to happen next based on our limited knowledge. And I think, if we can ontologize that so that it's not just about human observers trying to make the best prediction based on the available knowledge of what's possible in the next moment, but that every occasion of experience is doing that, then we break out of a kind of epistemological enclosure and we can recognize that possibility is um, intrinsic to the process of reality itself, and that moment by moment, each occasion of experience is um, based on what has already occurred in the past, then experiencing a field of possibilities in the future that are not just totally open. It very much depends on, again, the context within which it's arising. And so rather than
Hmm.
thinking that, there's just pure possibility and then a decision made as to which of those infinite possibilities to actualize, there's always a um, limited set of possibilities, or at
Hmm.
least um, some forms of actualization are way more probable than others, given the past that the occasion is arising out of. But moment by moment, decisions are being made as to how to actualize possibilities. And rather than thinking of the wave function itself as what's ontological, what's real, which would lead to a kind of multiverse, or rather many worlds, um,
Mm-hmm.
where there is no collapse, there's just infinite branching. Um, we would view the wave function as a description based on the situation that each system finds itself in, a description of what's
Mm-hmm.
possible for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and that those wave functions are constantly opening up and being explored and decided upon by each occasion in the process of its concrescence. It's the mental pole of each occasion, which is responsive to the physical pole,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and I think so. This is similar to the qubit um, quantum Bayesian interpretation. It's just it's pushing it further, I think, into an ontology of experience rather than an epistemology that would kind of reduce quantum theory to, you know, how human observers make sense of
Mm-hmm.
a non-deterministic reality.
So can you can you say again sort of the quantum wave function in this picture would
Mhm.
be viewed as sort of the constrained set of possibilities,
Yeah,
and each occasion can choose to actualize in one of these possibilities. Um, and how again is this concerning Bayesian way of thinking? I'm not too familiar with Bayesian statistics and the way of it looks at probabilities, but I do understand that in that framework, um, possibilities are more like um, yeah the um, uncertainties or unknowns than actual options, right? Am I?
yeah.
I'm butchering that probably. I'll have to ask my friend who's giving a lecture on Bayesian statistics at the moment, I guess.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, he would probably know better than me, but my understanding is that the quantum Bayesian approach is based on the idea that quantum theory is not describing objective reality. It's a tool that agents use um, to manage our expectations about what's going to happen next. And so, um, rather than thinking of a real collapse of the wave function, it's more again epistemological in the sense that the collapse would be more like the agent or the observer updating their inferences
Knowledge, yeah, okay.
about what's more likely to occur. Um, right. And so it's very observer dependent. Um, and I think you can give a,
But the observer could be the system itself observing itself,
yeah, I think so.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, okay,
Mm-hmm.
okay. So updating its own knowledge about itself. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. And then the measurement's always relative to that observer's interests. And so again, it's playing off that idea that information is relative to your interest as an observer. Um,
Yep. Yeah, okay. Huh, I like that. Okay,
yeah, it's so close to
I'll have to follow up on
a
that.
Whiteheadian take. Like I've listened to Chris Fuchs give a lot of lectures on this, and it's like with a few tweaks, I think it would be quite resonant with Whitehead's process ontology, which basically describes the world as composed of these agents. They don't have to be little, um, that are integrating the past and integrating what's possible in light of that past and engaged in a creative advance. Um, and so, yeah, it's just the shift from
Mm-hmm.
this epistemological to a more ontological approach.
Nice. Really nice.
Yeah.
Right. I'm looking at the list of things that I want to talk to you about. I think yeah, just to maybe because I think that I'll have to leave it at that. I think that was wonderful.
Yeah.
um,
We covered a lot in an hour.
um, yeah, is it
Solved
all
integrated
also
information
1 hour?
theory. We solved
Oh wow.
FEP, and we're
Yeah,
good.
yeah, exactly. um, and I think from as soon as we have a sort of a way of understanding the collapse in quantum mechanics in a reasonable way as a sort of a internally um, driven process, then I think from there on we can go with some way of decoherence interpretation of quantum mechanics, because then, as far as I understand, in most decoherence interpretations, the it's just assumed that the wave function collapse is sort of random in from sort of when and where it happens, and that could be just substituted with internally decided, I think, and the mathematics of the rest of the decoherence wouldn't really change, and then we could go to a more classical understanding of interactions, and from there I think we can again go to complex amplifiers to understand how bigger systems can have um, meaningful internal states, and yeah, we can associate that with societies and or Gaia and planets and maybe solar systems and galaxies and the universe as a whole. so so yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, and it's just opening up like sort of that black box of randomness as, what's leading to a collapse. It's we can read it as what's the payoff of reading that as not just random but as a subjective decision. Um, well, then we get this analogy between our own capacity to make subjective decisions and the components out of which we are made capacity to make such decisions. And so the
So it
payoff
solves the hard problem of consciousness, basically.
solves or dissolves or
Dissolves, probably more likely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
The problem with will not arise anymore.
that's the hope. Yeah. So all you have to do is believe in conscious atoms. No. um, I think it's an elegant way of the hard problem for me is a way of marking uh that we've arrived at a dead end. We need to go back up the trail and find where we went wrong in this maze.
Absolutely.
And try a different approach. Because otherwise we could only ever end up in a situation where our best accounts of how the physical world operates leave us like as conscious beings feeling like intruders.
Yeah, totally separate
We
from
don't
the world,
belong
right?
here. Like, where did we come
Exactly.
from? How is
Which
science
is
even
exact.
possible? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean this is exactly what we see happening in the world today, right? This alienation that so many people feel, not only from like the physical world, but as an extension of that, as towards each other, right? I mean, this whole loneliness epidemic, I think, in my mind, can be traced back to that exact turning wrong, wrong turn that we took in our description of the world, probably like a few hundred years back. Maybe blame Descartes again for this, because it's everybody does. And I mean, yeah. So I think that really we see direct consequences of the errors that we made in our description of the world having real world consequences for ourselves, but also for the planet as a whole, and the how we treat the environment, how we treat each other, and how we treat ourselves, and how we look at ourselves. And I think, yeah, that would be the last point on my list that I'd really wanted to like talk to you about. Yeah, because I see so many positive implications that a shift in our description of the world and our understanding of these things could have, that I feel like I'd want to have sort of a pragmatic part in this discussion as well, as to how do we advance this understanding. How do we bring it out into the world? Can we make it more popular, basically?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I would say just to qualify, our hatred for Descartes and the last several hundred years of mechanistic materialism and what it has done to the ecosystems of the planet and to our social relations as human beings is just to say, there's a certain reading of that history that thinkers as diverse as like Bruno Latour and Charles Taylor and even like Rudolf Steiner, they all see a kind of moral development which has taken place. And um, the way in which science, in its initially materialistic, mechanistic, dualistic understanding of nature and our relationship to it, or lack thereof, um, was was part of what allowed for this value of human freedom to manifest. So, in other words, it seems like historically, for us to become aware of the importance of human freedom, we also had to mechanize nature. Oh, nature's deterministic. We, in contrast, are free. Um, and I think something there's
Okay,
a
yeah,
there's
yeah.
a hidden there's a silver lining. There's a valuable baby that we don't want to throw out with the bathwater.
Yeah, I totally see that. I think I can absolutely see the value in taking that route. Um, Also in like emphasizing the role of the individual in a free market space, and promoting democracy over aristocracy and things like that. Um, but it feels like we've um, we've we've reached another crossroads that we should
Yes.
really take a different turn now,
Yes. Yes.
and rather today than tomorrow.
Right. Right. So yeah, exactly. It's materialism has overstayed its welcome. We have accomplished this moral transformation, which whether it was necessary to go through a few centuries of mechanistic materialism or not for these political shifts and moral shifts to occur, I don't know, but historically that's how it did happen, it appears. But exactly as you're saying, like this pre-modern sense of an enchanted cosmos where you have a sense of the great chain of being that Aristotle articulates and Aquinas reaffirms, where it's like, hell's at the bottom or at the center, and then you've got the minerals, the plants, the animals, the humans, the angels, and then God. That uh, hierarchical vision of how the whole organism of the cosmos operates, translated directly into a social reality and justified a very hierarchical social reality with the aristocracy at the top and slaves and plebs and peasants and stuff. Um, and so the the dismantling of that old and the disenchantment of that old cosmology is, yeah, again, part of what allowed us to arrive at a more democratic sense of human society, and also to move towards a sense of our continuity with the rest of life on this planet. Um, and so now I think what needs to happen, and Whitehead can really help with this, is uh, we want to take science seriously. Science is not a fairy tale, as he's always saying, but we need to recognize that there's a more participatory dimension to how we arrive at knowledge of the rest of the universe. That knowledge is primarily about relationship and maintaining relationships. And so, whether we're in the laboratory studying microorganisms, like every way we poke and prod that petri dish of microorganisms is going to affect how those microorganisms as agents then respond to us, right? And
Mhm.
so we can't continue to believe in this old scientific methodology where we're just outside of the system, neutrally observing it, whether it's physics or biology or psychology and sociology. As inquirers and experimenters and scientists, we're always going to be intimately involved in whatever we're studying, and our intentions, our
Mhm.
hypotheses are going to shape what we then observe, right?
Mhm.
And so we need a more participatory understanding of the methodology of science. And when we say, like Bruno Latour would, that
Mhm.
facts are socially constructed, that doesn't mean that they're not real. It means that a fact that's made in the context of a scientific laboratory and institutions and all the PhDs and the technology that allows for a fact to be well constructed makes that type of fact very different from a fake chart that someone at a think tank trying to pretend climate change isn't happening just like pulled out of their ass.
Mhm.
There are better and worse ways to construct facts. Um, and we can restore a sense of meaningful connection to the non-human world, to Gaia, to the rest of the organisms that we share this planet with, by granting them experience, granting them agency, granting the natural world intrinsic value, and that our values in some sense derive from cosmic values and Gaian values, and that we inherit this same creative eros driving
Mhm.
the evolution
Mhm.
of life, um, and we can bring our own economies and polities back into uh, a harmonious alignment with the natural world, which doesn't mean that we're not similarly agents who will transform our environment. But the question is, are we transforming the environment to make it more like a machine, or are we enhancing the life, uh, the community of life, that we depend on?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think the the emphasis of organisms in Whitehead's scheme is really driving, I think, the point home very clearly, of, like, as you said, not looking at things as machines, mechanisms, but as organisms that have internal desires and goals, and yeah, that you can relate to. I think that's very important, that I can feel empathy basically with the rest of the world. And as you said, that my knowledge about the world is relational. Um, and yes, facts are can be looked at as sort of social constructs. I would say that the idea of objectivity needs to be viewed exactly in that way, as what we um, what we look at as objective fact um, should be viewed as a sort of a socially agreed upon fact. Um, and this can be distinguished from just made up ideas or uh, alternative facts, which are not socially constructed and rigorously tested and integrated from parts.
Right.
But then also each experience of reality is, I think that that's also something that I really cherish in Whitehead's framework, is an actual real experience of the other. Because as I understand, if as you said in the beginning, your relation to my past is similar to my relation to my own past. So we can have actual, real knowledge about each other's pasts and experiences. It's not only sort of inferring, inferring through sense data, and it's not just a hallucination, right? It has something, this relational interaction with the outside world really gives me a direct knowledge about the world. And I think that's really important to me as well. That it's there's there's reality in knowing I can know something about the world and about something out there. It's I'm not a solipsistic isolated part. I am in deep relational communion with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Real communion is possible. And if anything, our inter or even intra subjectivity precedes our subjectivity in the sense that my ability to be and maintain a sense of individual personhood very much depends on the developmental context of loving parents and a loving community that reflected back to me that possibility of becoming, a more or less self-governing, responsible individual. And so individuality is a gift from the community. And, rather than imagining that we only come into relationship to other human beings by developing some complicated theory of mind, um, as a sort of intellectual exercise, building an internal model of you or whatever. No, that happens secondarily, perhaps. Um, but primarily, there are these flows of feeling that suture us together, and we emerge as individuals out of a common field of feeling, is one way to put it. Um, and yeah, just to circle back to the social construct thing, of like scientific facts, we could say are social constructs, but in Whitehead's deeper sense of society, that the construction of a fact depends not only on the human scientists that are engaged in that laboratory experiment and investigation, coming to an agreement with each other, but the organisms or agencies that they are interacting with are also part of the society that's constructing that fact, right? And which means again that if our particular way of poking and prodding, to use the poor bacteria again as the example, if that instigates a change in them, some evolutionary emergence that we didn't expect, all of a sudden the social construction which we thought had arrived at a fact is going to need to be revised because the bacteria they're not behaving in the way that we would have expected, and so we need to revise what we thought was a fact. Um, And so, yeah, society in the broader Whiteheadian sense, not just, it's not that facts are just made up by human beings. We're forming alliances with non-humans when we construct facts as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nice,
Mhm.
nice. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, um, maybe that's a good place to put a bow tie on this particular episode,
Yeah.
until we figure out what to get confused about together next.
Sure, that sounds good. Sounds good to me. It's getting late a bit here as well, so
Yeah, thanks for staying up with me.
pleasure. It was a pleasure. And I think
You
it,
said
it
you have this book.
I do. I should read it.
If you get a chance to read it, I'd love to discuss it with you as a,
Okay,
with your
cool.
background in physics and see how you feel about their treatment of the history of physics and um, the importance of human experience and the way in which they feel our physical models always come out of experience. And so we should be careful thinking those models and the abstractions they refer to could ever explain our experience. Um, yeah, I'd be interested in your expert opinion of their arguments.
I'd okay. I'll try. I'll try. I'm uh yeah. I don't read as much as I should. I'll try. But
Yeah,
yeah, that was wonderful. Um, and absolutely, I'll have some more questions next time. So
okay,
we will just stay in contact, right? Through email, and we'll figure out.
definitely. Yeah,
Perfect.
look forward to it. Have a good night, Flavio. Hope you were able to carve out some time for reading. Uh, I know you got your hands full over there. So yeah. All right.
I'll
See you next
try. I'll
time.
try. So see you next time. Goodbye. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.